Hello, and welcome to Working with CSS3 Layout Options. My name is Paul Sheriff. I'm a business solutions architect with Fairway Technologies Incorporated. Fairway Technologies specializes in custom software development. My assumptions for this course is that you already know how to use cascading style sheets, and you want to learn the new layout features that are available to you in CSS3. We're going to look at an overview of CSS3, take a look at the box model, multi-column layout, flexbox, and the grid layout. Let's get started. CSS3 is nothing more than the latest evolution of cascading style sheets. Now what they've done is they've split the CSS specification into different modules, and these modules are things like color, selectors, namespaces, media queries, style attributes, etc. The reason they did this is this allows them now to release new features by module without having to wait for everything to be done. This allows them to add features a little more quickly. CSS3 adds many new features over what used to be in the cascading style sheet standard. We now have a little bit more control over styles, and you'll find that we can now eliminate some JavaScript coding that we used to have to do. Some of the things that they've done is helped make things a little more standard. Let's consider the box model. Now the box model is containment and positioning within a style sheet. Okay, so what this means is that this is a metaphor for how positioning, margins, padding, and borders are applied to an element. Any element that you find in HTML. So for example, consider this CSS here where you have a div with a width of 100 pixels, a padding of 10, and a border of 10. So the question becomes, is this total box width going to be 100 or 140? Well, it could be construed as width plus padding left plus padding right plus border left plus border right. That's what some browser manufacturers may choose to do. Or others may say it's simply width. The problem is it really depends on the browser, okay, or at least it used to in the past. With CSS3 though, we can now control which method is used. So let's take a look at how we control the box model. Let's take a look at a sample. What I have here is I have three div statements, and the divs all have a different class to them. Box model normal, box model 400, box model 300. Let's go ahead and run this first, and then we'll come back and take a look at the CSS. Now this is the way most modern browsers interpret the box model. They'll actually take the width plus the padding plus the border. So as you can see here, I've got this box, and then I've got laid out next to it 400 pixels and 300 pixels so we can see, basically where this thing ends up. All right, so let's take a look at each of these CSS values here, each of these rules. So here's the first one, box model normal. So this is the one that's got a border of 20 pixels and a padding of 30 pixels and a width of 300, right? So that's the width. Plus, you got to add in then 2 times 30, 2 times 40, for a total then of 400, which is what we saw on the screen. Now, that's great, but there were some older browsers that when you ran this, let's take a look at IE here, and let's go into the F12 tools and turn on the emulation back to 5, and this is what was kind of called back then the quirks mode, where now you would actually get the real width, but then you would take away the padding and the border, right? So you'd have it excluding that. So depending on which way you want to run this would kind of depend on your browser, and that could cause some issues with kind of your layouts. So the CSS3 model now defines two different things that we can add to a box sizing property here. You can either specify border box or content box. So let's go ahead and run this one with content box, and that gives us exactly what we would expect. If we switch it though, and let's go back and try the border box, this will put it back to the way that it was, many years ago, okay, or kind of more that, the width model. So now you have the width, and then it's going to make sure the padding and the border fit within that width. So a couple of different ways that you can choose to lay out your box model. CSS3 supports some new layouts. Now there used to be 4 layouts available in CSS. There was block for kind of developing sections in a web page, inline for things, kind of going across horizontally, table for two-dimensional table data, and positioned for explicit positioning of elements. Well, we now have some additional types. There's a multi-column layout, think newspaper columns, and these columns can grow with the width of the screen. There's also a flexible layout, so think kind of more the navigational links like a nav bar, and grid layout, so think table, equally spaced rows and columns. They actually do a little bit more than that too, but let's take a look at each one of these. So the first one, multi-column layout, allows for multiple columns of text, and it helps break up long lines of code just like newspapers do. Okay, what they found is that when people were reading newspapers, they wanted things a little bit, not as long lines. The eye couldn't follow it as much. So it helped to break up the words so that the people could read it easier. Well, we now have new properties added to CSS to support this. We have things like column count, column width, and column gap. So content is now flowed automatically across columns as needed, again, depending on the size of your screen or how many columns that you actually set up. Another layout is called flex box layout. Now, flex box layout will help you eliminate the use of float and positioning. We have a new property called display, and you can set the attribute to flex. New properties also include flex direction, flex wrap, flex flow, justify content, align items, and align content. Another new layout we have is called grid layout. This helps divide a page into major sections. So again, a new property here called display, and you can set it to the property value grid. This basically gives us rows and columns. Now, it goes a little bit beyond just what you might get out of a table, though, because these can be overlapped, they can be layered, we can make one column a different size than the others, because we now have this new fractional unit of measure. So what this does, it will divide columns equally among the available space, but you're also able to add like 2 FR and then 1 FR, so the other one would be 2 times more than that particular column. And they take care of all of the mathematics for you so that we don't have to figure out, how much percentage things must be to divide this grid up appropriately. So let's take a look at multi-column, flexbox, and grid. Here's an example of the multi-column layout. As you can see, I've got a long article here with a lot of words, and then there's this vertical bar here, and then the article continues. And if we then resize this, you can see what happens. Okay, the words just keep getting split across these couple of columns. So the way that we lay that out is for a particular div, which I'm going to do here in an article, and then I got the header part, but then I have the div. So the div is within the article, and inside of the div I've got different p tags, so different paragraphs of data here, and even some code layout. And what I've done is I've defined the div here to have a column dash count of 2. That's why we saw the 2 columns. I've got a column gap of 1 em. I've got a column rule width, so that's the rule that goes down there in the middle of thin. The style is solid, and the color that I wanted to use was black. So this gives us a 2-column, multi-column layout. I can take that same article here, right, with all the same div, p tags, and all of that. Everything's the same as far as the body, but now what I've done in the div is I've made a column count of auto. I've specified a column width of 12 ems with, again, the same column gap the same rule width, rule style, and rule color here. What this is going to do now, it will vary the number of columns depending on the size of the browser. So here you can see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns, but let's now shrink this down a little bit. Now we got 4, now we've got 3, and then finally down to 2. So depending on the size of your browser, it will take up more space. Again, pretty neat different way of laying things out using this multi-column layout. Let's take a look at using the Flexbox layout. What I've done here is I've set up a nav with a class of flex-container, and then I just have a series of divs. Let's go up and look at the CSS. So the divs, I've just done a margin of 0.5, a padding of 1 em, the background color of blue, and a color of white. And then I have a flex container. Now I have the display flex commented out right now. And then let's take a look at what this looks like. So there's our divs, right, that are 0.5 ems away from each other, a padding of 1, background color of blue, and a color of white. Now let's add the display flex in now. So let's uncomment this, save it, come back over here and refresh. And now what we have is a simple little navigation bar, right? Okay. So this stays, as you can see, it just simply goes horizontal for whatever you have. Okay, that's great. So let's do a little bit more now though. One of the things we can do is change the direction of our Flexbox. So in this case, I'm saying let's now do a column-wise flex container. So now we have the display flex, but the flex direction is column, and the align items now says flex start. So what's the deal with this? Well, we can also change this to flex end. Let's save that, and let's go now try and run this. And what we have done now is told it to put it at the end of the browser, right? So a direction is column wise, so now it's going to go to the rightmost column. Pretty nice. Let's now take a look at the next one, which is we add our other property on now called row reverse. So I went back to a row version now because that's the default, but I said row-reverse. So when we see this now, look what happened. It actually took the divs and reversed them, also doing from the end. So it actually implies the flex end and reverses the order of the divs. I didn't change the order of the divs. They're still home, products, maintenance, and login, right? But all I've done now is made them go backwards by specifying this new property, flex direction, row reverse. Let's take a look at another example. In this one, we're going to use the justify content. So justify content, we can specify a lot of different things, but we have space dash around. Let's see what this one does. So now what it does is it spaces them out across the browser width. Notice how things will shrink and expand by adding this space around. There's a lot of other values we can do here. We can do center, save that, run that. Now it just centers the items with the specified amount between them that is done by the margin here. We can also do flex end, which we've already seen an example of this, so you should know what this one's going to do. It's going to put it at the end. We can do flex start. So now it puts them back to where they were before. We can also do space between. Okay. Very similar to the space around, okay, but you're also specify the space between. Let's take a look at our next example here. On this one, what I've done is made this login button just a little bit longer than all the others. In fact, as I keep growing this one will stretch, and the rest of them will stay the same. So let's go take a look at Flexbox 5. What I've done in this case is I do still have the justify content in here. I've set it to flex start, so all of the particular divs are against the left-hand side. And then what I've done is I've added a new class here called stretch with a property of flex and a value of 1. I've then applied this particular class to the last button, the login button here. Right? So the login now has this class stretch. That's what causes it to now stretch out through the rest of the browser width. So we don't have to do anything else, but if you want one button to kind of grow with everything, you can apply this. You could apply it to a couple of different ones, and those two will stretch, and the others will then stay the same. All right, next, let's take a look at our next one here. And this one uses the flex wrap. So one thing I want to show you is look what happens when we finally get to a point on these, right? The values start disappearing. The div statement starts disappearing. So let's go to our next example. Now in this one, I've added a flex wrap. So now you can see that it simply wraps each of the columns now into different rows. We do that by specifying flex-wrap, wrap. Pretty simple. Okay, everything else, again, is the same. I just added a few more div statements here so we could see the effect of having this wrap and having it automatically figure out how many rows and columns to use based on the size of the browser. So what could we use this for? I mean, obviously navigation's great. We could also use this to really kind of lay out a whole website, right? A whole site layout here. So now we've got, as you can see, we've got a navigation bar up here. I've got a couple of different columns. I got this one column here that's kind of has this light gray background, and then this column here is in white. And notice how it just simply changes a little bit as I grow and shrink until finally I get to a point where now it needs to split that column onto another row. Pretty nice. So let's take a look at this guy here. So in this one, I've got a nav with the background color of black. We saw all of that. And the display is flex. And then our nav items here. So I'm using an anchor tag for each one of these, right? So here's our nav. And that was the piece that we saw here at the very top. Right there, all of my nav. Pretty simple. Okay, now let's take a look at my container here. So I've got a class of container. And I have two divs inside of here. Div class left, div class right. In the left, I've got an H2, I've got this div, and I got this class called fake area that just kind of makes it look like a larger size here. Okay, and that's what this guy is right here. So what's important here, though, is the div class left and right. Okay, so I've got a left and a right, and I said the flex is 25%, and the flex is 75%. So very similar to kind of laying out a table, right? What you would normally use a table for in the past. Now we can actually do purely with CSS, and we don't need to add in Bootstrap or, Material or any of the other, kind of CSS libraries that are out there. We can now do it purely with CSS. So we don't need to have these, other responsive design CSS guys and add them into our site. We can do it all just through CSS. Next, let's take a look at the grid layout. Here's our new grid layout. So I've got 4 columns defined here. These columns shrink and grow with the size of the browser window. So how did we lay this out? I simply created a nav with a class of grid-container and then 4 divs. Column 1, column 2, column 3, and column 4. The divs, pretty simple, just a border, a padding, a background color, and a color. And then here is the new thing. So in this .grid-container class, this style, what I have is a property called display with the value of grid. I then added grid-template-columns. And here is the new fraction unit of measure. 1FR, 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 and 1FR. So this is basically however many divs you have, you can now specify these FRs. I can also change this. I could make this one a 3. So what happens if I do that? This one now becomes 3 times the size of the others. Again, really nice that we're able to do this, okay? And we're not having to, figure out any fractional differences. We're not having to calculate any of this using JavaScript. It's now just all done with the browser. Very cool. Okay, so use any of these that you want here and set them up in any, any manner you want. We could change this to a 2, save that, come back here, refresh, and now you can see this one is 2 times greater than the others. And again, the browser figures out how to keep it at that. The great thing, we're not having to use tables or anything like that. It's all just done with div statements, which gives us much more flexibility. Let's now go look at the next example, and we'll go ahead and run this one so we can take a look at what it looks like here. Well, now you can see that I've got a couple of rows now. Again, everything's growing and shrinking as you'd expect. So let's take a look at this. Now what I've done here is I'm still using the same grid class, grid-container, and then I've got 6 divs now. However, if we take a look at my definition, I've only got the 4 columns still. So what happens? Again, the browser's smart enough to figure out that, hey, you've got more columns than you do that are basically defined here. So it just simply creates a new row for us automatically. Again, nothing you need to do, automatically just adds the new row. Now, keep specifying these over and over again. Boy, that can get a little tedious. So one of the things they added was a repeat function here. So we can say repeat 4 rows, 1 FR for all of them. Very nice. Okay, so now when we have our divs down here, right, 4 columns here, right, 4 div statements, we're saying repeat 4 times. Everything looks exactly like it did before, and everything's good. But again, just a little bit less coding. I think it makes it a little bit easier to have this nice repeat function. Let's take a look at our last example of grid layout. This is where we can now add a gap between the columns. Okay, so you can see the gap in between each one of these columns now. So let's bring up this one. What we now have is a grid-column-gap, and you can specify your unit of measure. And you can also specify a row gap as well. So as things move to the next row, it will automatically leave a gap between the row as well. So I did the same thing here where I'm still using the repeat of 4 columns, but down here I actually have 5 columns. So it automatically creates the new row, and as we can see, it automatically creates the gapping between the new row as well. So in this video, we've talked about how CSS3 has added on some great layout options that will really help you with your responsive design so that you don't have to add in Bootstrap or Material or one of the other CSS libraries out there. We can also build some very flexible site layouts with these features. Well, my name is Paul Sheriff. Please search for me on pluralsight.com. I have several seminars up there that you can watch, everything from Angular to MVC, all sorts of different things. So take a look for me up there. You can get all the sample code that I've presented here at pdsa.com/downloads. Just select Fairway Video Blog and then select Working with CSS3 Layout Options. Again, take a look at fairwaytech.com and you'll find out all of our services that we offer. And again, search for me on Pluralsight. I hope you enjoyed this video. My name's Paul Sheriff. Thank you very much.